It's my absolute honor to introduce our two keynote speakers for today. I have been following them for some time, their work and their incredible contributions to the space of inclusive leadership and the space of belonging across the industries. And we have Dr. Gerry, I want to say in Spanish, but it's Ebalaroza Tunnell, I believe. And she will correct me, and they both will correct me later to say it. Did I get it? I hope so.
You got it.
Wonderful. So Dr. Gerry is the founder, principal consultant, and president of Co3 Consulting. Dr. G identifies as Pacific Indigenous scholar, a transformative leader, and a facilitator and designer of change. And that she is. Born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, now residing in Washington, she has learned how to thrive in two worlds, Indigenous being and Westernized thought. She is the host of the Evolution of Aloha podcast, gathering a mix of stories of social change from women around the world. And actually, that is an awesome podcast, along with the other podcasts that I'm going to mention later on. All those resources and links are, if you scroll down from this stage, you will find all of that here. So please click on them and start following them. What they provide goes far beyond from today's session, and you will be just as addicted to learning from them as I am after today. So now we have Jeremy Tunnell, lead consultant and facilitator for Co3 Consulting. Jeremy identifies as a student of Indigenous ways of being and a person of European descent. His ongoing work to interrogate and dismantle whiteness is a consistent lesson in humble listening and heartfelt personal inquiry. Jeremy specializes in identifying and dismantling colonized social processes, resilience, conditioning, and guided worldview. As the co-host of the Plowline podcast, he works with industry leaders discussing fundamental subjects such as diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the colonized mind, unified field physics, and human consciousness. Without further ado, let's hand it over to Jeremy and Dr. G. I'm so excited for today.
Thank you, Saray. Thank you,
Saray.
everyone. Aloha kakayaka. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Gerry Ebalaroza-Tunnell, and what a great honor to be here with all of you at the second annual Inclusive Leadership Summit and Career Fair.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeremy Tunnell, and we're excited to share our knowledge and experience with you this morning. Our teaching encompasses traditional wisdom that's recovered and handed down through generations, as well as innovative conclusions from study, research, scholarly observations. We hope this unique combination of Indigenous wisdom and Westernized knowledge will bring insight and enlightenment to your experience and journey as inclusive leaders throughout our country and the world.
As an Indigenous storyteller, I'm devoted to using stories as a tool that can bring complex ideas alive. Storytelling is sacred in our cultures, and it strengthens relationships, sustains communities, and nourishes our spirituality through aloha. And in the Hawaiian language, aloha is more than just a greeting. It is a sacred word that means love, grace, empathy, and compassion. But it also means it's a makeup of two profound words, alo, which means forward-facing front and presence, and ha, which means the breath of life. Aloha means sharing our stories, the openness of our hearts to another person's story, and the power and healing that can be found in genuinely hearing and listening to another. Aloha means that when we engage in deep listening and share our experience and stories, we exchange knowledge through our collective dialogue, and we can create a new understanding of being in the world. And this is aloha, the exchange of ideas, the resolution of conflict, the changing of perspectives, and the evolution of our collective nature. So stories are medicine. They have the power to heal just as they can harm. For many indigenous cultures, storytelling and oral traditions are medicinal practices and forms of that traditional knowledge. And through storytelling, we seek to cultivate understanding, foster collaboration, and promote unity by bringing people together to listen deeply and think systemically about their shared stories. And we hope the stories we share with you this morning will inspire you and nourish your mind, your heart, and your soul, and fill your day with lots of aloha.
The story we're going to convey today is the story of change. We love to talk about change. We call for change in our social systems, but then we struggle to adapt in the face of it. We discuss the systems around us and how they should be evolved, but rarely consider the critical element for affecting that change, our own individual personal development. Isn't it ironic that we constantly look outside of ourselves for change when in reality, change begins and ends within each of us? The first lesson Gerry and I learned in our master's program at Antioch University, which was called Whole Systems Design, was this. Systems only change when the people that make up the system change, because we are the system. The struggle against racism in our country is an ongoing effort that requires us to have the tools and resources necessary to affect real change. It requires us to understand how the system of racism impacts our society and ourselves, so we can actively work to create a more equitable and just world for all. But this level of change requires each of us to create an ongoing personal practice of self-reflection, self-awareness, and self-regulation, so that we can recognize implicit bias, understand our place in privilege, listen to those with lived experiences of oppression, dismantle our own racialized identities, and understand how systems of power are maintained through structural inequity. Having the right tools allows us to challenge these structures at their core and create meaningful progress. It helps us to recognize our own bias and prejudice. With these tools, we begin to shape a world by reshaping the way we see the world.
Of course, when Jeremy and I started this journey to engage in the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we lacked the tools of self-reflection, self-awareness, and self-regulation to change ourselves. Our work began about 10 years ago when I started my master's program in 2012. As I entered this journey of self-exploration, I found myself trying to understand the path my ancestors took to arrive in Hawaii. I found myself trying to understand the colonization of Hawaii in connection to the global colonization that took place worldwide. I hoped that my findings would bring me to understand my place in colonization. Growing up in Oahu, aloha is everything. It's woven into the fabric of the culture. And as I moved on to my doctoral work, exploring aloha's origins and the etymology was relatively easy decision. Still, the path of self-reflection I took would prove quite difficult. My journey of introspection was infinite and filled with unpredictable turns. Connecting to my roots unearthed a sea of trauma anguish, and revelations that only facilitated more growth. So it took a lot of work. Before leaving the island for the first time, my father warned me about how I would be discriminated against because of my skin color. I didn't have a reference for such discrimination because for me, it didn't exist for the Kama'aina people of Hawaii. I was stubborn, the typical middle child who always pushed boundaries. And at 17 years old, I left home after completing my high school graduation a year early. And despite my naivety, I quickly discovered the racism my father warned me about. The harsh reality suddenly became clear, and even those who meant well inflicted an onslaught of microaggressions on me through predatory language and subtle bigotry. The insidious nature of prejudice left emotional wounds too deep for ignorance to erase, and in some cases, the intent to hurt could not be overlooked. I learned pretty quickly how painful racism and bigotry could be, and I didn't want to hurt anymore. So I internalized the lies. I began to believe that who I was not good enough, and I pushed myself toward assimilation. I believed the only way to success was to adopt the dominant culture's way. I became a perfectionist and a disciple of constant progress. I worshiped at the altar of significance, success, and accumulation. I dug into quantity over quality, possession over partnership, and individualism over community. Tima Okun highlights these values of assimilation into the dominant culture in her work, The Characteristics of White Supremacy.
A link for this document is going to be shared out to all of you. It's a good tool, but it's essential to understand what these characteristics represent. These are not qualities for which we should judge each other or seek out individuals engaging in white supremacist behavior. The brilliance of Tema Okun's work here is that she has identified our culture's dominant value system. The document could just as easily be entitled Values of Colonized Culture or Characteristics of the Dominant Culture. They should not be used to look around at your organizations and pick them apart. These are tools for self-assessment and self-reflection, first and foremost.
In 2014, I went home for a class reunion, and I was proud of my accomplishments, education, and distinction, and I wasn't afraid to boast. I started to look down on my people and used academic language to symbolize my self-importance and superiority. I had become a pompous ass. Then one of my brother friends checked me and he said, "Hey sis, do you know that every time you come home, no one wants to talk to you?" And I was confused because I thought I was cool. And I asked him, why? And he said, "Because sis, you forgot where you came from." He told me that no matter how many letters I put behind my name, they should never be used to disconnect us from our roots. He reminded me that the power of our heritage and stories should never be forgotten. He reminded me that without the strength and wisdom of generations before us, we could never have achieved what has been accomplished today. Every breath taken is powered through the connection between our lahui, our people, and the Aina, the land that birthed us into this world. And he was right. Deep down, I knew he was right, and I began to take my connection to ancestry, history, and indigeneity seriously. Higher education gave me the skills and tools to analyze and observe social systems. I understood the deep interconnectedness between my ancestry, identity, race, culture, power dynamics, and privilege. And I was beginning to understand how colonization wanted to wash it away. With my newfound skill set of academic research, I dug deeper into the concept of racial oppression. With connection to my Aina and my people, I realized that our humanity is much more complex than skin color. Although the more I discovered, the deeper I devolved into a silent rage. I was angry with myself because I knew what I had done in denying my culture and my people. And I was angry at white people for creating and upholding this system of oppression in our daily lives. I needed to learn more about these structures of racism. So I attended conferences just like this and on race and entered into the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion with full force. It only served to fuel my fury with each attendance. And with each step I took toward understanding race, my anger grew. I brought that anger home. I began seeing my husband as the epitome of everything I wanted to dismantle. He was the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, patriarchal colonizer. He and everyone who looked like him were the ones who had caused this problem, and they needed to fix it. The words that spewed from my mouth at home were sharp, foreign, and unkind. During this time, my husband had been holding space in our relationship so I could finish my degree. He ran a business he hated for 6 years to ensure the bills were paid and to keep our household financially stable. I labeled the intention of his actions from this new perspective I was developing as patriarchal, racist, and toxic masculinity. I began referring to him as the colonizer, the white man, and the oppressor.
At this time, I didn't really know what was going on. I just wanted to come home from work, make some dinner, proofread some of Jerry's papers, and go about our lives. That simple life didn't look like it would be a possibility any longer. These conversations of race and colonization were a new language in our household. Early in our relationship, we were a dynamic couple to our friends. We playfully acknowledged our interracial reality. And when we first got married, we were just a newlywed couple. We enjoyed life together and argued. We dug into some counseling and we did what we needed to do in order to make it work. And it was work. Sometimes it was incredible. And occasionally it was unbearable. Like all of us, Jerry and I have dreams and aspirations that we are constantly working towards. And we've experienced the pitfalls for which we never want to walk near those craters' edges again. Life was a challenging journey that we worked together to remain in as active partners. But when Jerry began her PhD work in transformative studies, it became more complicated and more demanding. As Jerry began to seek out her family's heritage, she began to go through a personal decolonization process. I had no reference for recognizing it as anything but a necessary conflict. I had no tools or skills to understand how we got here or what to do about it. We would spend that year in a perpetual confrontation like we had never experienced previously. Once deeply interconnected towards a common purpose, it felt like our lives were heading in two different directions. If we were going to stay together, I realized that my understanding of whiteness and colonization needed to evolve. But I was stuck in a singular question. How could the things I was taught be so dramatically different from the reality Gerry was revealing? I began to bring my graduate school research skills to bear on this issue. And in my journaling, the inquiry I had come up with was this: what is whiteness and where did it come from? Gerry would introduce us to a framework for this journey that we both adopted.
And as I was researching Aloha's origins and the ancient cultural context, I came across the 5 phases of decolonization that Hawaiian elder Pokalaʻinui wrote. The phases are rediscovery and recovery of the ancestors, mourning our collective loss, dreaming of a new world, commitment toward a new way of being, and action towards a new way of doing.
I watched Gerry move through these 5 phases of decolonization as if they were written for her. She used them as a tool for self-reflection and self-awareness. As her anger began to process through these 5 phases, my frustration was still unprocessed. For the first time, I started to pay attention. For the first time, I began to see the colonizer in me, that my wife modeled a path towards forgiveness for her own ancestors.
And for me, it started, of course, with rediscovery and recovery. I began to look into my family's immigration to Hawaii in the early 20th century. I saw the interconnected truths of my grandmother's and my great-grandmother's journey through poverty, immigration, and the mixing of new cultures and DNA.
I took the invitation for rediscovery and recovery of the ancestors sincerely. I reached back beyond whiteness to the ethnic identities of my immigrant American ancestors. These English, Irish, Scottish, French, and Norwegian ancestors left Europe impoverished, escaping famine, warfare, and seeking out new opportunities. This story is an American story, but it's not the indigenous ancestors I was seeking. So I reached farther back, beyond the borders and the names of countries that we know today, and I found new names for these ancestors. These were the Norse, the Gauls, and the Celts. They lived indigenous ways of being that all of our ancestors lived at one time. Media representations at the time of ancient Northern European tribes began to take on a personal reality for me. The slightest murmur of ancient Gaelic or Norse on television piqued my interest. I began to question who my ancestors were. What was my indigeneity? Who were my people? Where did we come from? What lessons were left behind in the ancient regions they inhabited? In my whiteness, I was taught that European indigeneity was not worth valuing. It represented fur-clad peoples desperately migrating against the constant onslaught of a never-ending winter. These ancestors were dirty and ragged. And frankly, their only value came from being fortunate enough to have survived to become the genetic progenitors of thinking and reasoning Europeans.
Yet 10,000 years ago, all of our ancestors lived in an indigenous way of being. Today, 6% of the global population is considered indigenous, continuing to live connected to the land, the water, sky, and each other. Forms of colonization have waged a slow war against indigenous peoples and ways of life to bring the survivors into compliance with colonized practices of dominion over the world.
What we discovered was that colonization was like a virus. Colonization turned the colonized into the colonizers.
And we call it the colonized mind. I now entered the stage of the 5 phases of decolonization, mourning. For the first time, I realized my historical place in global colonization. I saw my Filipino ancestors as they lived their indigenous ways on the island of Cebu. The arrival of Magellan in 1521 and the Treaty of Cebu in 1565, and the 400-year subjugation of the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers. I saw the colonization of my Hawaiian ancestors at the hands of our own king. I witnessed his lust for power after witnessing the tools of colonization aboard Captain Cook's small fleet, gunpowder, cannon, and modern warcraft. My mourning raged through our household. My husband said that sleeping next to me sometimes felt dangerous. My anger was an expression of the pain and trauma I was digging up. And while it had a place in my journey of healing, under its current manifestation, it wasn't doing anyone any good. I believed I was woke and deliberately made people of European descent ashamed of the color of their skin and blamed them for the racism in society. I thought this was the only way to end oppression, but it only perpetuated a further divide.
My morning was distant. It was still and full of unknown. European Americans knew nothing of their indigenous ancestors when Rome colonized them. They were unaware of their traditions, language, and beliefs. For them, indigenous ways of being had long been replaced with the paradigm of dominus coloni, the owner's tenant. They went from being people who were a part of the land to people who merely rented the ground under their feet. They went from free to dominated, only to someday bear the children who would become the dominators themselves. I began to feel the pain of my ancestors from the colonizers' point of view, and also from the colonized. A generational trauma emerged from the post-Roman rule and through the rise of the Holy Roman Church in Europe. Europeans annihilated Europeans for the sake of dominion and conquering. Landlocked between seas, oceans, and the Caucasus Mountains, Europe went through 1,500 years of bloody transformation. Papal and noble wars, 800 years of crusades, the last of which was the Reconquista, and ethnic cleansing along the Iberian coast. Ethnic purity gave way to ideological purity, and the Spanish Inquisition began in 1478 and would last through the entirety of the Spanish and Portuguese colonization. As the church's influence rose and began to fall, enlightened ideals began to take their place. In 1436, the invention of the printing press changed everything. Literacy rates skyrocketed as Bibles and books became available to the European population. Ideas started to disseminate throughout Europe, and university systems began to rise. The concepts of superiority and dominance and race began to circulate. Centuries of unchecked European trauma had met with the light of innovation and invention. As the world was divided and classified under scientific observation, so was humanity. And a subdivision under species was created called race for Homo sapiens. Over several centuries, this pseudoscience of race became the paradigm through which Europe saw the world. In the middle of the 16th century, this paradigm of dominion would combine with technological breakthroughs in cartography and shipwriting. The Portuguese were the leading edge of this new era of discovery, and in 1552, Pope Nicholas signed the first of 6 papal bulls, instructing King Alfonso V of Portugal to, and I quote, "Sail to the western coast of Africa and invade, capture, and vanquish and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ. Reduce their persons to perpetual enslavement and take away all of their possessions and property." It would be revised in 1455, 56, 81, 95, 1506, and 1514 as new colonization campaigns began. The colonization of West Africa, the Philippines, the Caribbean, and Cortez's campaign against the Aztecs and the Mayans in Mexico and beyond. Global colonization as we understood it had started.
During these discoveries, my husband and I grew apart, and I went through the doctoral dissertation coursework, and I continued exploring colonization's origins. I couldn't stand his colonizer's presence, and he couldn't understand why he had become the enemy. We had little of anything significant to say to each other, and we experienced a bit of distance from each other in the form of separate beds. But my monthly itinerary to San Francisco for my doctoral work at the California Institute of Integral Studies provided us with much needed respite. And we found a breakthrough during one of these sessions with my cohort in the spring of 2016. I was sitting atop a rock overlooking Rockaway Beach in Pacifica. And while admiring the natural beauty all around me and feeling my ancestors' presence, what seemed like magic began to unfold. Out of nowhere, a little red fox was sitting on an adjacent rock, just about 15 feet away. And as if it was orchestrated by some higher being above, a California red hawk circled right overhead while a pod of dolphins glided through the waters just offshore. And I know it can sound a little woo-woo, but I think we should be open to a little bit more woo in our lives. In this significant spiritual experience, I understood that our relationship needed amends. Jeremy must have been feeling something too, because soon after that moment passed, he called me, marking a new beginning for our hearts to come together. And after that long reconciliation conversation, I will always remember what he said. He told me that he had been thinking long and hard about his whiteness and racial identity. He began to question what it meant to be white and the origins of whiteness in general. These brought up more questions than answers. He was discovering that the veil of colonization had covered us all, and he called it living in the colonized mind. Then I said something to him that I never expected to say. I told him I had spent so much time seeing the murdered, the raped, and the colonized ancestors that I didn't consider my Spanish and Portuguese ancestors coming to the Philippines for a new life. After the conquistadors and priests came the farmers, the bakers, the cobbles, carpenters, and ranchers. At that moment, I realized that I was the colonizer too. I had arrived at the dreaming stage of the phases of decolonization and understood that I needed to learn to coexist peacefully with the Spanish Portuguese ancestors within me. And that night at dinner, as the evening sky burned orange, a powerful surge of energy and ancestral presence filled me with inspiration. Uncontainable creativity took over as I grabbed my pen to inscribe a poem onto a napkin. The blood of my ancestors run through my veins. A possible fisherman of the Philippines, a Spanish flamenco dancer, a doctor of Chinese medicine, a Portuguese curandero, a healer, a Polynesian warrior, I do not know. Buried secrets of treasures never to be found, deciding factors of my identity limited to the roundness of my eyes and the hue of my skin. What are you? Who am I? Do I choose to narrow myself down to a single identity, expunging the rest of the bloodline that flows within my veins? I cannot. I must not. To embrace myself, I must embrace them all. They are me, and I am them. They were the colonized, and they were the colonizers. Therefore, I am the oppressor, and I am the oppressed. The blood of both runs through my veins. Does this mean that I may also be the murderer and the murdered, the raped and the rapist? I am embodied by their genetic ghosts. Their tales tether my soul in the presence. I am a healer, and I am a warrior. I am them, and they are me. I carry their hope for tomorrow. I am the bridge. I am the cultural healing. I began to speak with these ancestors and make amends on their behalf. I replaced my rage with a far fiercer flame that I call gracious anger.
After a year of finding ourselves separated by history and ideology, we had found a place to begin again. Together, Gerry and I began to move through dreaming and mourning. We saw that race was a construct imposed upon the world to launch the age of colonization. It was a tool to fool European peoples into believing the New World's conquests were ordained by God. The religious and educational systems of the time convinced them that all other races were inferior and that the Caucasian European identity was superior. This was the birth of the colonized mind. Race would go through an even more profound evolution when it reached the English colonies in North America. In 1607, the corporate endeavor of the Jamestown settlement began. It was tough going. The colony failed twice and was finally taken over by the Crown. There were three classes of people that made up this colony. The first were the noble elites who ruled the settlement. The second were landowners made up of middle-class Englishmen. And the final group were the indentured servant class. This group was made up of English poor, former serfs who had been pushed off the land as the era of serfdom ended in England and the rise of industrial manufacturing took hold in the cities. These were my ancestors. Pushed off the lands they had generationally tenant farmed, these peasants now found themselves homeless, deemed insane, and considered the criminal bottom feeders of English society. The king wanted them gone and the cities cleaned out. So they were forced on ships and shipped off to the New World to work a 7-year contract for landowners and noble elites. At the end of this contract, they would buy land if they could and begin a life in this new world if they survived. Many didn't. And then in 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown with 19 Africans on board removed from a Portuguese enslaver ship. It was called the White Lion. They were adopted into this indentured servant program, and in the decades to come, a robust multi-ethnic middle class grew of English and African landowners. By the 1660s, a problem was arising. England had no more homeless or imprisoned peasants to send. And the viable land on that small spit where Jamestown was founded was running out. Laws were passed to keep the indentured servants into bondage longer. Laws designed along gender and ethnic lines. Laws that affected women and their Black population the most. A rebellion ensued. Bacon's rebellion didn't last long. It began in 1676 and was over by the spring of 1677. A group of multi-ethnic indentured servants rose up and burned much of Jamestown to the ground. They then dispatched themselves to the lands outside of the village of Jamestown and began raiding indigenous communities to make way for their expansion into the territory. Long-held treaties were ignored, uprisings occurred, and the king dispatched the Marines from the Caribbean to put the rebellion down. In the wake of the rebellion, a debate between the king and the governor of the colony, Sir William Blakely, ensued. Such a rebellion could never happen again, because if it did, the fragile settlement would surely fail. And yet they had to address their labor issues. Blakely came up with a solution. He and the ruling colonial nobles would invent a legal evolution upon the pseudoscience of race. In 1681, Blakely created a legal caste system designed around the phenotypical characteristics of skin color. He divided the working class population between two defined parameters in the law, white and black. It was the first time that those descriptors were used in a legal sense. In doing so, Blakely determined that any tenant in the indentured servant program with white skin could own land, make law, and participate in society. However, tenants of black skin would spend the rest of their days and those of their children in perpetual enslavement. With this decree, the noble elites of Jamestown Colony created the racialized identities of white and black that we know today, as well as the system of white supremacy that we're also familiar with. They also created chattel enslavement, a wholly unique form of enslavement in the world where the color of one's skin determined one's worth and humanity. 100 years later, this law was adopted into the US legal system with the first Congress of the United States, and they passed the first law in 1791, which was the US Naturalization Act. In that law, it determined that any person with sound mind and white skin could become a US citizen. Citizenship was not determined through education, wealth, family lineage, intelligence, invention, creed, only by skin color. Over 300 laws would be created based on the legal precedent of skin color in the United States until the 1964 Civil Rights Act signing ruled those laws moot. This was literally the birth of a white nation.
As we moved into the commitment stage of the processes, the phases of decolonization, Jeremy and I committed to embracing our unique identity, no longer allowing ourselves to be limited by the arbitrary labels society assigned to us. And this is more than just a label. It is an empowering way of recognizing and honoring who we are together beyond skin color or bloodlines. And by identifying as a multi-ethnic couple, we celebrate not only ourselves, but also each of our ancestors' legacies. Our new commitment worked to leave behind the pseudoscience of identity and the manipulative legal constructs of white, black, brown, and people of color. We can no longer deny the deep-rooted and devastating consequences left by colonialism. As society continues to define, separate, and categorize us based on race to determine our levels of privilege or oppression, we must recognize that this false genetic doctrine is only a social construct with real implications for generations. It is time for all of us, regardless of cultural background, to take action toward breaking down these constructs and creating an equitable world where every child everywhere can thrive. To remain in a place where we define ourselves and our relationship in the highly flawed social labels of white person and person of color gets us nowhere. Indeed, living in this society means we must acknowledge where those labels place us. But that is only the starting point. We must continuously engage in conversations that may activate our somatic response and have the tools to become self-aware of our thoughts and reactions by pausing to reflect and learning to self-regulate when emotions are high. Together, Jeremy and I enter the final stage of decolonization, which is action.
There was no going back. If we were to move forward together, we had to take an intentional action to dismantle the racialized identities associated with being a white man and a woman of color. I had to start by dismantling my whiteness and the inherited internalized supremacy I'd been indoctrinated into. I needed to find my ancestors by learning to reach back through time, create a feedback loop. It would require trust because I couldn't see and I didn't know them. They had been left behind so long ago. Many of us here can empathize with this. Some of us are closer to our indigenous ancestors than others. Some of us come from lineages that left them behind long ago. Others from those that were torn away. Regardless of how we got here, we all have the same responsibility to heal.
As I strived to dismantle my internalized oppression, I found ways to process my emotions, create resilience, stay in clarity under challenge, and have coherence with the past. As I began seeking the cloak of isms and identities I placed upon myself and wore it with pride or shame, I discovered that these isms and identities could be pulled back, examined, altered, healed, and even left behind when they became more destructive than beneficial. I found that when the time comes for us to change or grow, Creator will make things so uncomfortable, we will eventually have no choice but to change. My journey as a scholar went beyond formalized Western learnings to open my heart to ancestral indigenous practices. I forged a new path towards self-awareness defined by native biologists, tribal healers, and ancient astronomers, combined with modern social science. I combined the indigenous wisdom with westernized education and developed the guiding principles of Aloha, A-L-O-H-A, as a personal practice. These teachings have inspired an effective transformation method in both body and spirit for Jeremy and me, and the many people we have shared it with. It is spiritual and pragmatic and forged a path forward that is deeply rooted in ancestral knowledge of the past for this moment today. And it starts with A. A is for ask. Unlocking the power of questioning can be an effective tool for turning complex roadblocks into opportunities. It's a bridge connecting those with opposing viewpoints and encourages creative solutions that may have been hidden or previously overlooked. And by propelling us to consider ideas we wouldn't normally entertain, even taboo questions can lead to transformative changes in our culture and institutions. Taboo topics help us break down cultural barriers and engage in constructive conversations about complex subjects, exploring matters such as race, racism, and colonizations. Topics that are often overlooked or avoided. L is to listen. The need for human connection is so strong when this connection is created with presence, alo. It is one of the greatest gifts we can experience. Simply put, people need to be seen and heard. But to really understand this phenomena of being seen and heard, we must create a platform that creates safety, confidentiality, and compassion. This is when active listening, or deep listening as I like to call it, comes into play. It naturally emerges from the discipline of mindfulness. When people are not interrupted or judged and can express themselves at a deeper level, this is when they can feel truly seen and heard. it is also essential to listen to your own heart as well. O is to observe. Observe the sensations in your body and the body language of others and the energy flowing in between. The sensations, emotions, and somatic response in your body are not just signals for us to react, but are also signals for us to pause and contemplate. And by scanning for the felt presence of physical energy, we learn more about our internal physiology and mental and emotional state. We see that sensations in the body are not impermanent. And although they are part of us, we are not defined by them. In fact, we get to choose how we label and react to sensations. Observing our bodies can help us address emotional reactivity and stress when engaging in complex conversations. We learn to listen what the body needs and wants and can make better decisions about how we should respond. H, the heart is the guide during engagement and a place to return when you find yourself disconnecting. The work of Jedi's, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Debbie's, Diversity, Equity, Belonging, and Inclusion, or any combination of social justice words, is heart work. Our heart is a cornerstone of aloha, where love and understanding dwell. We can genuinely listen like never before by reconnecting to that ever-present part of ourselves. Revisiting this heart space can be a powerful tool during challenging times. It brings us back to our center so we may respond with humility and empathy instead of judgment to those around us. The heart is the guide throughout the entire process of engagement and a place to return when we find ourselves disconnecting and not deeply listening. Without the guiding influence of the heart, we can easily fall prey to reactive emotions such as insecurity, anger, fear, blame, shame, guilt, and other energy-draining reactions and behaviors. And finally, A, for adaptability and acknowledge. Here, we acknowledge that our perspectives and worldviews may differ from others. Concepts such as gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality seem to be born out of an innate need for us to categorize each other. By limiting ourselves to only those who view the world as we do, an invaluable opportunity is lost. And that is the understanding and appreciation for different perspectives. Expanding our worldview beyond what's familiar can instill cultural awareness and help build strong communities with diverse values. It is vital to acknowledge that part of the work to create healthy and thriving communities is acknowledging the diverse nuance of race, nationality, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, religion, and many other aspects that make up cultured human beings. Even more important than this is the constant work of shedding these identities that we each layer upon ourselves and connect to our shared humanity. Within the nuance of being, we must learn how to adapt to the complexity of our socialization and the socialization of others, and ensure we genuinely do no harm. Steeped in ancient tradition, aloha remains deeply intertwined with the spirit of Hawaii. Its power radiates from my ancestors who first spoke these words to today's modern world, connecting us like an unbroken chain of profound reverence and respect for the sacred place of my island home, Hawaii. For us, the tools of Aloha, A-L-O-H-A, was an invitation to begin the journey of self-rediscovery and decolonization. And we hope you will join us on this journey to utilize Aloha as a stepping stone to developing a culture of belonging and prioritizing social and emotional well-being. And as Auntie Palaki has said, The world will turn to Hawaii as they search for world peace, because Hawaii has the key, and that key is aloha.
Our presentation technician, Grayson Chester, has been sharing links for the tools that we discussed today. And if you scroll up in the chat and find his name, you'll find those links. Today, we challenge you to unfold your own story. Begin from a place of compassion and work to remain in your heart. Breathe into change. Reach back to your unseen ancestors. Rediscover and recover your indigenous connection, and remember, you are part of the land, the sky, and the water around you. They literally make up the fiber of your being. Challenge your notions of identity, dismantle what no longer works, and come back to your humanity. This is how we heal the colonized mind.
Mahalo, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this story of aloha and healing. And if you wish to stay in connection with us, here are the links on how you can remain in aloha. So mahalo, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to our stories, and I wish you well. Aloha.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for that engaging session. There were so many valuable points that resonated with me personally, and I really appreciated this discussion. It really touched me. I'd also like to thank our attendees for joining our session today, and to remind everyone that our AM breakout sessions will be starting in just 15 minutes, 11 a.m. Arizona time, which is also Pacific time. So if you haven't done so already, please review the session schedule and select one of the 2 sessions in leadership and management or education. I hope you enjoy the remainder of the 2023 Inclusive Leadership Summit, and thank you again.